Let's get started with the next phase of the conference. Let me explain our agenda for this next part of the conference. We will now follow Stephen's longer presentation with three shorter ones, one after the other. Following that, we will have a general discussion amongst the panelists, and after that, we will open the discussion up to the floor. So first at bat will be Rinna Kullaa. Rinna is a visiting professor now at the University of Vienna. She's a recent contributor to a book called The Use and Abuse of History that I have been reading with great interest, and of course the title lends itself in a way to what we are doing today. She works on Russian Soviet influence in the Mediterranean and issues related to the construction of the European Union's foreign policy. She sort of spends her time between Paris at Sciences Po, Vienna, and so she's global in her interests. She's done postgraduate studies at St. Antony's College at Oxford and a doctorate at the University of Maryland. So Rinna, many thanks, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I normally don't need a microphone, I'm quite loud, but maybe today I have the microphone. Yes. Well, we were encouraged in the instructions for today to think about straightforward but also contradictory ways in which the past history matters. And I think that I will start with maybe the biggest contradiction today at all. I have a point to make, but it's quite abstract and difficult. And moreover, I think I will be as a woman running backwards in time. So I will start from 2018, then I will talk about 2016, 2014, 2010, and only last about 1918. But I will try to stick to my time. I'm originally a diplomatic historian of Europe and the Balkans, and I specialized also in Russian foreign policy. My professorship, which I'm on leave from in Finland today, is in global history. And once a year I'm being asked to define what are the big research goals I would like to set for my group of students. I mean, 2017 and 2018 I have been thinking over one concept which I would like to study in European history, but it's very difficult because it actually is about the future. I would like to think about what does the future look like in Europe and globally if it's not led by hegemons. And what I mean by that is that it would be very useful for my students to think about the history, not only foreign policy history from the point of view of hegemons, but also of those of non-hegemons, because perhaps in the future, the future will not be led by hegemons. And I keep coming back to this topic over and over again. And why do I do that? Well, we already have talked about 2016 here today about the election of Donald Trump as president. And on that night that he was elected, I was with my most favorite colleague of global history in his car at 7:30 at night at Princeton University. And my colleague looked at me and said that, okay, now this man is going to be elected and the world is going to change. Why? Because the world before, for a very long time, had been determined by agreed upon norms, trade, and directions led by the United States, and they had been commonly introduced after the birth of the European Union. Before then, in 2014, I had been asked constantly in my own country about if we are experiencing a new Cold War. Why? Because I am a professor who makes courses about Cold War history, and I am an expert on Russian foreign policy. And I also didn't like these questions very much because ever since I was a young graduate student, and I think I have also seen you many times in the Woodrow Wilson Center talking, I didn't like it when people would often talk about how history repeats itself. Why? I thought if it always repeats itself, then there is a common pattern, and it's not a very interesting question to think about what is this common pattern, right? Well, the other reason why I didn't really like the concept of the new Cold War is that I didn't quite believe in it. I thought that the world in 2014, if we, as in run backwards, that the world was more diverse than the Cold War world, that there were more states that, not only in number more states, but more states that had actually quite diverse interests that they were able to exhibit. This was normally the standard answer I gave if I was in front of any kind of press. Why? Because I also didn't think that it was a very positive signal to give to talk about in my country, in Finland, about a return of the Cold War. Until I was absolutely certain about it, I didn't want to talk to that direction. This is also very honest. But moreover than that, the point of view that I wanted to give you today here for our questions about lessons from the Habsburg monarchy for the EU is that for me personally as a historian, for the new projects that I'm writing, for my personal history, it's not the year 2016 or 2014 that defined the new direction. What I often think about, since our panel is about the new world order, and after all, we can only know that something is a new world order if we know the history, what was the order before, right? So why does history matter? That's one of the reasons. Also, I think we need to think about the future when we are defining the new world order, because after all, much like global history, the future will be whatever we want it to be. And this is a bit different. So historians have to talk about facts and they have to think about what the history actually was. But when you talk about the future, you should think about what you want it to be. Which is why I would tell you that maybe my turning point for the New World Order isn't any of those years. I often think about the year 2010. Why? Well, 2010 is the year that I personally returned to Europe. I had been educated in the UK and the US, and I returned to Zagreb and to Helsinki in 2010. And 2010 was the year when I became the head of European studies, but I was also involved in Croatian negotiations for the EU. And that is also the time when I think I realized personally, but through a positive way of thinking, I remember the early 2010s as a period where the United States, unlike we think today that Donald Trump somehow has abandoned Europe or global concepts of having mutually agreed upon norms, United States already at that point in the early 2010s, in terms of approaches to the Western Balkans, often wanted to support European aims and European Union in those efforts. And I recognized and saw that many times when Hillary Clinton was a Secretary of State and she would appear together with Catherine Ashton. I don't think they got along very well personally behind the scenes, but their goals were the idea that European Union should actually lead Europe and Europe's near abroad. And so I wanted to talk about that today just as an example that when we think about the New World Order, we are still decide which one that we are talking about and who terms what is the New World Order and in reference to what. Now, going back to my teaching, I very often teach now courses about global history, and they are these histories of hegemonies. They can be histories first of empire building. Habsburg Empire is one of them. Some other empires had larger overseas holdings. After that, I teach Cold War history, which is often about two superpowers, which one of them, the Soviet Union is seen as inheritor of the Russian Empire, and the United States is often termed not as an empire. And then we come to an area of, somehow in that Cold War period, post-colonialism, and the discussion of what kind of empires were before is often undertaken by the Cold War rhetoric. And we only come to an era of history now, after all of that, where maybe the future will not be led by hegemonic powers. Well, I'm interested in this for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that I'm a professor in a small European state, and much like the former parts of the Habsburg Empire, these states are all going to be part of that future. And maybe our concepts and more histories of these states will define the future. That's why I want to explore it further. And as I promised, I would be running backwards to the lessons of 1918. Luckily, I don't have to say so much because Stephen here already spoke eloquently about Habsburg history. There are historians like Stephen and Peter Judgens, whose Habsburg Empire, published in 2016, make very convincing and clearly argued merits and lessons of the Habsburg dynasty. And many books explain to us that the Habsburg Empire in many ways was a unifying imperial state also. It had imperial institutions and administrative practices, also cultural programs that helped to shape local societies in every region of its empire. And it would be quite difficult to sit here today for me without really thinking about that, because I believe this building was one of the schools that was built by Maria Teresa. Now, she was not 100% successful in universal education, as I understand, but still she had many of the concepts that we hold dear for today. On the other hand, I also, in my general modern history Europe courses, I often teach another book that takes quite a different view to Habsburg Empire, A.G.B. Taylor's Habsburg Monarchy, 1809 to 1918. He's very controversial, and in his book he makes much fun of decision makers, which I don't think is allowed today at all. But his work is important to me because I'm a diplomatic historian of foreign relations, and he explains the Habsburg Empire very much, and its end particularly, very much as a matter of foreign policy making, of trying to escape internal problems into looking at foreign policy, and this is important. He also has very vivid characters and characterizations of decision makers that are not flattering, but they are very vivid. And if you read that book, and as I do with my students, we think about the fact that also sometimes personalities in decision makers matters. So for me, from 1918, I think we have these two contradictory lessons. One is that empires can be also unifying and have many positive merits, and the other one is that foreign policy can also be as a scapegoat disruptive, and that leaders' characteristics matters. I think that those are the two lessons that I have today. But perhaps I could be so bold as to suggest third direction of seeing the Habsburg Empire, in reference to lessons of 1918 and the world order of today. I've always been a great fan of contradictory and different types of histories. For me, if somebody brought up a new idea in their book about an old concept, it was often the most convincing. And if we look at other empires in European historiography, a year ago, there was a very large collected volume published in France in reference to the French Empire called Histoire mondiale de la France. And this volume represents the history of France, not from the point of view of its national narratives or its traditions or its leaders. It represents it from the point of view of contested topics in its world or global history, the global extension of French history, including race, national identity, international relations as the history of France. Moreover, the work decenters France from how its history has been written before, and it shifts a national to a global perspective. It also replaces one narrator's voice with hundreds. There are maybe, I think, 60 authors in this big volume. And it tries to communicate better with the public by writing short chapters on different topics. Now, they're supposed to be funny, and they are not. I have read almost 1,000. I think one thing there was funny. And I normally make jokes, but I don't think I even have a joke here today because 1918 is not such a funny topic. But what I would like to suggest then is that perhaps thinking about the relevance of 1918 and the Habsburg Empire in particular, one could also think about it from the point of view of its international history, not from the point of view of only its nationalities even, or its harmonizing effects. And I think that in my mind this somehow connects to my ideas about what the world could look like in the future, what if it's led by non-hegemons, because after all, so many of these current non-hegemonic states are descendants of the Habsburg Empire, or there can be areas in the Mediterranean that had something interconnections and interactions with the Habsburg Empire. And I think that that's sort of my point today. That's my perspective on these questions.
Okay, Rinna, thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much for this presentation. As the enforcer, I have to be severe with these time things, otherwise we're going to get into trouble. So we will turn immediately to Katherine Junger. Katherine is presently the research director of the Ukraine and European Dialogue project at the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna. She has an AB magna cum laude from Harvard University, and she has a PhD from Yale University. Her dissertation was Contested Confession, the Greek Catholic Unit Church in 19th century European politics. She's also recently edited a book with Tim Snyder, let me see if I can find it, which is called The Balkans as Europe, 1821 to 1914. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to follow two very interesting opening talks. So thank you very much. Of course. There you go. How's that? Is that better? Excellent. So where I want to begin today is by trying to push us further east with the goal of helping us to understand Europe more broadly. The whole point of the project that I run at the Institute, the Ukraine and European Dialogue, is to insist that Ukraine has to be part of the European story, past, present, and future. Our premise is that Europe has at least as much to learn from Ukraine as Ukraine does from Europe, and that Ukraine, despite the many ways in which we can look at it and think of it as a sort of unusual case in millions of ways, in fact, in many ways it's actually hypertypical. And by looking at Ukraine and understanding its experience deeply, we can get better insight into what's going on in Europe and the world more broadly. So what I want to do is to use the Ukrainian experience of 1918, the legacy of 1918 in Ukraine, how the politics of history are playing out, to understand one of the crucial aspects, as I see it, of the legacy of 1918, which is the myth of the sovereign nation state, right? So to take Ukraine as an example, as my sort of prototype for understanding this, may initially seem counterintuitive. What we think about when we think about Ukraine is that perhaps there was a nation state for, a few weeks here, a few months there, but no sustained project that ever was actually able to take hold. But what I would argue is that in fact, what happened in Ukraine was simply a more condensed version of what happened all across Central Europe in this era. Other projects may have lasted the entire interwar period, perhaps shorter, perhaps longer. But Ukraine was not unique in its failure for a nation state to take hold. So why I think that is important gets at what history can teach us today, what the lessons of 1918 can be for us today. And I think the most important of those is that bad history matters perhaps at least as much as good history does. What I would say is that the narratives of nation states, of the sort of grand celebrations of nation states that we see, for example, look at the news from Poland over the weekend, remind us of the ways that misinterpreting what happened in the past has dire political consequences for the present. We see that in this case in particular, and the thing that I would, so let me sort of say why I think we need to understand why the Ukrainian case failed, that will then shed more light, failed much more quickly, which will then shed light on what's actually going on elsewhere. So I think two things are particularly important in the Ukrainian case, one of which has to do with territoriality. The Ukrainian territory was historically split, of course, between empires. Then in the wake of World War I, it was actually split between 4 states by the time the dust settled. There was a Bolshevik Ukraine, which became part of the Soviet Union. Galicia, Western Ukraine was part of the interwar Polish state. Romania controlled Bukovina, and Czechoslovakia controlled the area around the Carpathian Mountains. Now, all of this is to say that simply there was no territory on which a Ukrainian nation-state could emerge. So the territoriality of that prevents the emergence of a narrative that Ukraine was an integral nation-state. The other thing that I think is extremely important is that there's no chance for Ukrainians to contend that theirs is a mono-ethnic state. That is simply too difficult to maintain in a way that some of the other national state narratives are able to deny the diversity that has historically existed within their boundaries. These states were all multi-ethnic states, despite the sort of narrative that they were nation states. If you think, we sort of project back the consequences of the Second World War, of the ethnic cleansings that happened, of the Holocaust, of the massive populations that were either killed or removed to create these more mono-ethnic states. This happened this certainly happened in Ukraine, and I do not in any way intend to deny that it did, but it happened in a different way, and Ukraine continued to be a multi-ethnic state. It has to continue to be considered that way today. So in that sense, again, I think looking at Ukraine reminds us of some of the myths that we've created that, or perhaps not all of us, we are good historians here in this room, but that that the sort of public narrative of history has been created in these countries. So I think if we think about the ways public history and memory are being used across Central and Eastern Europe today, I think I would like to contend that Ukraine is in some ways, and this is going to be tough to say, in a better position than these other places. This probably sounds completely crazy, right? Ukraine is a country at war. It has been invaded by a neighboring state. Territory has been seized from it. And yet, they are forced to grapple with the diversity of their populations, with the complexities of their history in a way that other Central European states are not always forced to do in such a dramatic way. The other point that I would like to make, and I'm going to keep this very short because I'd be more interested in discussion than what I have to say here. But the other point I would make is that the misuse of history can have very real political consequences, geopolitical consequences, consequences for human lives. One of the things that's happening in Ukraine with the narrative surrounding the war, surrounding the Russian invasion, is that the Russian state apparatus is able to construct a false historical narrative because we don't know our history well enough, right? They are able to say, these territories were historically part of Russia. Novorossiya is a phenomenon. We have the claim to these territories. And when they can do that and get away with it, it's because we are not being careful enough to understand our own history. This has led to tens of thousands of deaths. It has led to almost 2 million people being displaced from their homes within Ukraine, and the consequences of it are real. And so what I would say is if we can push back against these false narratives of history that cordon off individual nations that say this is Russian territory, et cetera, what we can do is begin to combat the narratives that give rise to war and conflict. This is a very simplified understanding of it, I know, but I wanted to make this point very strongly because I think it's one that often gets lost in what's being discussed today. So I actually think that rather than go on about this, I think I will stop here and then we can sort of discuss this further.
Okay, Kate. Kate, thank you very much, and thank you very much for keeping in the allotted time slot.
You're welcome.
We now turn to Allan Janik. And Allan, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to describe you as the grand old man of cultural studies here in Austria. I mean, he is really a towering figure. He is the co-author, as everyone I think knows, of a famous book called Wittgenstein's Vienna. He has a new book coming out in December, I think, on Otto Weininger, a case study. And we're very, very happy that in recent times he has renewed a close collaboration with us here at the Diplomatic Academy. So Allan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm a philosopher. That's in my soul. When I was 11, I looked into a mirror and I posed the question, how do I know that's me? Well, after about 5 minutes, I had to lie down. Said me. But I'm a philosopher who also cannot possibly think ahistorically. History matters to me. And I'm not alone as a philosopher who finds history indispensable for his task. You mentioned Tom Benedetto Croce, R.G. Collingwood, his English counterpart, of course, is one of my is a paradigm and a hero. Well, I don't have a prepared speech, as it were, and nor do I have really a message. I have some anecdotes, a couple of interesting things that happened this morning as we've been sitting here. We began to watch November 3rd, 1918. I began to think back to my graduate student days over 50 years ago, back at Brandeis University, a Jewish university, which at the time I began studying had no PhD program in German. The professor of German, and he was the whole department more or less when I began in 1967, was a man called Harry Zohn, one of the most committed Viennese I ever met, and one of the people to whom I owe most. And the first dissertation that Harry directed was a critical translation of November 3rd, 1918, the author of which is sitting in the third row. Catherine McHugh-Licklider. So circles, so complete themselves. Now, we don't seem to be able to go through this meeting today without talking about Donald Trump. I'd rather not. Among other reasons, in October of 1916, I found myself at a meeting of the European People's Party think tank, European Ideas Network in Rome, sitting next to Antonio Tajani. And he said, "Al, we got Allan here. Al, what do you think? Can Trump get elected?" I said, "Of course not." Not a good start, but I then qualified that by saying, but if he does get elected, he'll never be able to rule. And that, I think, is showing itself very much to be the case as his administration dies a slow death by its own hand. Anyway, 1918. I tend very much to share Stephen Beller's perspective. If we think of so 11, 18, and the days before, after, as being crucial, we focus on much too little. Most of what happened at that time was long predetermined. And I'd like to focus, because I think history matters. The real question is, let's get behind the collapse that took place there, which I will put to the side the achievements that collapse made possible. like women getting votes and things like that. It's another issue. It's positive. I'm aware of it. But I want to look at the collapse. This collapse was fairly thorough. Because when one thinks, in the end, the monarchy, the monarch, these two monarchs more or less called all the shots. And a monarchy lives from its aristocratic basis. That was not there in 1914. We have one general of any interest coming from the aristocracy, Schwarzenberg, who was, by the way, with the Tiroler Kaiserjäger, of which we Tiroler Kaiserjäger are very proud, and that was that. You know, there was no class, as it were, that was supporting the emperor in his decision. There was a structure, it's a bureaucratic structure that worked for good reasons, which Stephen identified, the excellent educational system, etc. But I mean, these were the hired men. They weren't the people who were whose loyalty created a monarchy. I mean, we were going back to, at one point, I believe it was Stephen who mentioned the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, once again, this is a feudal aristocratic structure. It's a pyramidical structure. It's a hierarchical structure, and that element simply wasn't there. And it wasn't there in many respects. I mean, there was a leadership gap. There's a leadership gap in the monarchy that one found at many levels. The aristocracy, for example, well, if they weren't going to run the army, why couldn't they run the economy? Well, they liked to be partners in financial operations, but when it came to doing work, they weren't very good at it. So for example, Prince Esterhazy had to hire Ludwig Wittgenstein's grandfather, who's the really interesting Wittgenstein, Hermann Christian, to run his estates for him, and siphon off a huge profits, which the Austrians, Wittgensteins, then used to build up their wealth and to consolidate what they had. So I mean, there is a problem that I don't know if this has been discussed, but I certainly haven't come across much discussion of the fact that, I mean, basically there was an enormous failure of participation on the part of people who should have been at the forefront in the war. And as we see, I mean, each study that appears tells us how early this war was being lost and how much was being lost. And I will remind you of the work of, I think, a book that everybody should have to read, and that's Maureen Healy's study of Vienna during World War I and the problems of hunger that are arising already more or less at the beginning of 1915. I mean, by 1918, it's a wonder that so much held together, that there wasn't much greater chaos when one looks at the details. They're truly gruesome. When one looks, I mean, and once again, everything having to do with this country is full of paradoxes. So, despite it all, at the beginning of 1918, the monarchy had realized its war aims. Serbia was more or less powerless. The Eastern Front was more or less taken care of, and the Italians were in retreat. What more could you have asked for? Why do we stay? I don't propose to answer that question, but I mean, it's one you can ask. The paradoxes and the fascination never ends in respect to this huge conglomerate. Now, so that I don't talk absolutely too much, I want to switch gears a little bit, because part of our theme for today has to do with has to do with the European Union. I want to read the last chapter, the last paragraph of what I consider to be the best book on the genesis and state of the European Union. It reads as follows: European politics is ultimately sustained by a many-headed national public. Although this public has never yet chosen to step out of the European circle, splitting into its component parts, it rarely regards Europe as our concern. Only when members of the chorus, rather than just the actors, individually inhabit their dual role, will it be possible to complete the passage to Europe. This is Luc von Middelaar, a philosopher and a political scientist who was secretary to Herman van Rompuy, writing that in 2015. I think then a cry for action. But as far as I can see, we're going backwards rather than forwards in the project of creating participation in European life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Allan. All right, we now move into the discussion phase. I think we'll do this in two parts. Firstly, we'll give all of the panelists a first shot at a comment or questions or whatever. And after we go through them, we will open the floor to questions and discussion with the general public. Before we do that, though, I want to summon two ghosts from the past. I want to invoke some spirits. Because I think we need to have them here since we're talking about 1918 and world order. And one of those ghosts is Lenin. I think we haven't mentioned him yet, but if we were around in 1918, he would have been very much on our minds. So I invoke the spirit of Lenin and the hopes and fears that were raised by the specter of the Bolshevik Revolution, which lasted for a very, very long time. And I think it's hard to understand 1918 without that. And of course, the other specter, the other ghost, is none other than Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Let's not forget that the basis of the peace were the 14 points, and that its idea of placing international relations on a new footing, that is to say, international law, international organization, by which he meant the League of Nations, arbitration rather than war, open covenants openly arrived at, that this was really also a radically revolutionary idea about world order in not to mention the fact of nations based on self-determination, which had so many complicated consequences in this part of the world. I also mention Wilson because it's quite tragic, to me anyway, to watch, to imagine Wilson arriving in Paris in 1919 and Trump arriving in Paris in 2018. And I think I can't think of anything greater than the contrast between these two different visions and these two different men. But in any case, when we talk about world order, let's have these ghosts floating around a little bit. Okay, we now turn back to our panelists if for any comments, questions, reactions that you would like to make. And in any order. Stephen, you want to go first because you...
True. Well, I would just say to the idea of the need for the chorus to participate, as it were. I think that's the key issue, and it is a question of rhetoric, basically, and information, communication, of what institutions like the United Nations or the European Union do for what they achieve for the specific communities, and I think most people just simply have no idea because the communication of these things is so bad. They have no idea what the European Union does for them. I mean, Brexit. The irony is maybe every country should have a vote to leave the European Union, then find out in a kind of Christmas Carol kind of way what the consequences of it are, because they are disastrous, as the British I think are beginning to realise. So maybe that's what we need.
I have been saying this in Brussels for over 10 years, and nobody's listened for 10 years.
They probably don't
Because the Economist, which our colleague cited yesterday, said about 10 years ago, the European Parliament does everything but what a parliament is supposed to do, namely represent. It represents parties and not people. And until that changes, forget it. I mean, when you talk to parliamentarians, I talked to the head of the Italian delegation. It was about 4 years ago or so, a meeting in Lecce, in which he said, "How do you expect me to talk to anybody? I don't have any time. I don't have any time for this." Well, this means that there is a fatal mistake in the construction. You've got to make time. I mean, politicians in a liberal democratic order who are not talking to their electorate are not doing their job. It's as simple as that. The problems here, I think, are very, very simple. And by the way, one thing in favor of Trump, as a philosopher, people like Trump and the situations that they produce are very important, because he forces us to ask the question, what are we doing here? Why are we so discontented? Why is this guy such a disaster? I mean, the simple answer, the non-historical one, will be, yeah, because he doesn't do what we always did. And I cannot be satisfied with that kind of answer. I cannot be satisfied with that kind of answer. I mean, he brings together a whole lot of flaws in the American political system that have been there for a very, very, very long time, that nobody has wanted to do anything about, really and truly. People have complained, but the people who have complained weren't the people who were causing the problems, and the people who were causing the problems weren't listening to the people who were complaining. So it's not quite. It's not quite like as though no one knows where the problems are. The people who create them are happy with the situation, and I think that's the case in Europe as well. With the East, with Poland, and with Hungary.
Did you want to go, Rinna?
Yeah. I have a question for Stephen and Allan. I was most interested from this morning in the question of emotional bonds being useful for the EU, and and the exploration of that topic from Habsburg history. So I wanted to ask, what did you think about that question?
The emotional
Bonds between the previous parts of Habsburg monarchy as a political concept that is lacking today.
Elaborate, please. So, I mean, I think, what do you mean by that? Because I just want to, in case I don't get this right.
I don't also know exactly what I mean by that, but I think that in the early talks of this morning,
Right.
we talked about the legacy of the Habsburg monarchy, and also of 1918, and that how in the way that we just heard about the discussion of the European Parliament, there are many complaints about political forms and political procedures, or that Europe is too much politics.
Right.
But perhaps one of the achievements or realities of the Habsburg monarchy earlier on was that there was an interaction and actual emotional bond of people across borders. So what I actually concretely mean by that is that I often tell my students today that the invention of the European Union was different for my generation of people, because it allowed Finnish people to be both Europeans and Finns in a very concrete way. That you have a passport, you can think about that. And when you allow yourself to have multiple identities, the society becomes more flexible. Now, emotional bonds this morning, the way that we discussed it, I think meant that there is an appeal to Europe. But it's something that I thought about, that perhaps were there such bonds in the Habsburg monarchy across borders between people or their identities?
Yes. The point is that the politics of the monarchy became one of essentially of nationalism, but the day-to-day life of people remained actually. There were still German areas of Bohemia, for instance, which were German and Czech, and Prague there was still interaction between Germans and Czechs, and that was the way life was. And for interesting enough, especially I think Lawrence Cole has pointed this out, that there was a large amount of there's a reservoir of loyalty to the dynasty in the more the rural populations, where the national element didn't come in. This is more Peter Judson than Stephen Bella, but didn't come into it. And in fact, one of the things was the nationalists had these campaigns, and they kept on having these campaigns because they didn't work always, right? Because the local populations actually resisted being driven apart by that. Now, over time, like in Budweis, for instance, the politicians and the administrators, in order to solve the political problems, ended up dividing this, or coming to the conclusion that the division of the population was the way to go forward in order to have a compromise. Well, in fact, Moravia is the classic instance of that. Then you had a situation where, in fact, the populations were divided politically, right? And in fact, you ended up having ascriptive national identity, which is kind of anti-Austrian in many respects. The irony was, Emil knows much more about this than I do, but the irony was in Moravia, there was one group that actually wasn't national, right? It's the landowners, was it? Landowners could be German and Czech, whatever. In other words, right, basically the aristocrats, essentially, could be whatever they liked. But the Germans had to be Germans and the Czechs had to be Czechs, and they couldn't change anymore. But nonetheless, the overall day-to-day life, right, remained pretty kind of everyone lived life whether they were German or Czech together, which is what that Hoffmann-style quote was about, right? This. And so politics and reality don't always match.
Well, if you were a peasant, it didn't make a hell of a lot of difference who you were being exploited by. Now, I say this advisedly. My source is the letters that my Aunt Caroline, who lived to the age of 14 in Galicia, wrote to me in the 60s and 70s, talking about how ruthlessly both the aristocracy, as far as they were present, and the big landowners exploited our family. So, amen. One of the things you need to have emotional bonds are people to imitate. I mean, this is what George Washington and co. knew when Washington made out of himself a legend. I mean, this is part of the Stoic philosophy, as a matter of fact. And we don't have very many real European heroes. I want to suggest one that we should have. It's probably the most forgotten person, most quoted and most forgotten one at one and the same time. And that's Robert Schumann. Schumann lived it all. He lived through 1871. He lived through 1918, and he lived long enough to give us the vision, not necessarily the practices, but the vision behind the European Union, which is largely forgotten. The 8 chapters of For Europe, his book, it should be read by everybody today. 4 of these chapters are more relevant than they ever were. One is titled, Europe Cannot Be a Mere Military or Technological Unity. Europe is basically a cultural unity. I mean, we're losing that right and left. He did not see a room for Britain in Europe. It's clear to him. It doesn't, that you can't make Europe with Britain. And he would have been agreeing with Charles de Gaulle and Churchill for different reasons. We're taking the same view. So if one looks, Schumann sees also, for example, that, and again, this is writing in the 50s, part of the European mission is a humanist mission that goes beyond the borders of Europe. He's a Frenchman. He knows what what disasters they've created in Africa, which were very, very clear. I mean, in the 50s, there was a man called Le Pen who was a prominent politician. So in Algeria and in the Algerian causes already then. So I mean, Schumann lived through it all. As a lawyer, he wanted to see this grand synthesis that would be Europe. He realized, however, that this was superhuman. The foundation of Europe is, in his eyes, Christian. It's not Christianity militant, but the humble concern that Christians are supposed to have for other human beings. As the way to make up for the disasters, the military disasters that had taken place throughout his life. So here you have someone that embodies everything that Europe should be. Now the problem is he had a collaborator in ways much more clever, Jean Monnet, who cared he cared about all these things, but what he cared mostly about is that things got done. And I mean, the heritage of Europe is much more the heritage of Monet than it is of Schumann. As long as the job's getting done, as long as we have the idea that there is an answer to the question, we go on to the next question, and as much as possible we quantify these questions, and we form centers to study problems that grind out the answers, and that is just that's the way it is, and that's not working.
Okay, Kate, would you like to make one final comment? Then we'll open up the discussion to the floor.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And one thing that Rinna, when you posed your question initially about sort of is there this Habsburg cultural, emotional bonds, one thing that occurred to me is that one thing that I initially interpreted your question to be is if they resonate still today. And so here I would only get back on my hobby horse and say one place in which they extremely are still resonant is in fact in Galicia, in eastern Galicia, in what is now Ukraine. You go to Lviv, you go into every coffee house more or less, and you'll still see a portrait of Franz Josef hanging there. And so I think, so this is perhaps one hopeful thing that we can say here, is perhaps outside so one of the reasons that Franz Josef still has such resonance there, that the Habsburg project still has such resonance there, is the recognition that a multi-ethnic polity in which there is some sense of patriotic attachment to the center because it provides you with goods that you wouldn't otherwise get, that still exists there. And I think that that's also what you saw on the Maidan. What you saw was people coming out with European flags in Kiev, on the streets of Kiev, standing out there for months, recognizing that actually the EU is still something that is worth aspiring to be part of. And so that's going to be my optimistic hobby horse here.
Okay, thank you all. Let's move now into this final phase of discussion. Salome, are you one of the microphone people for this? You're not? Where's oh, we need Daniel. I need to find the microphone people. There we are. Come, allora ragazzi, venite. Come up here and get these microphones. We have another one there. I would ask everybody who asks a question to tell us who you are, And above all, please make your question to the point and quick. We'll start with Professor Wodak here.
Well, thank you very much. You already introduced me. Thank you. I'm Ruth Wodak. I'm a discourse analyst, University of Lancaster and University of Vienna. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much. I have two questions. One is this kind of Habsburg nostalgia, which I still notice here, is interesting for me as a myth. Yeah? And I'm wondering why nobody actually talks about, except for you, you just talked about the peasants, about the others. The working class, for example, they're extremely poor people. I live in the 10th district, where the Ziegelböhmen were actually the guest workers in the beginning of the 20th century from former Czechoslovakia and Bohemia, and they lived in caves, yeah? And they lived under terrible conditions. So the class question, the social stratification wasn't touched on at all, almost not, and I think that is something to be considered. And the second question is a remark also about the European Parliament, which I know well because I've studied it, and I've done a lot of ethnography in Brussels. And I think it's not by surprise that you have a political representation there, which sometimes overrides nationalism, but not always. So there is a tension between sort of representing, let's say, Austria or Finland, and representing the People's Party or the Socialist Party. So you have both. And we shouldn't forget that the EU was founded as an economic, primarily economic unity and not what it is now. Yeah? So the EU has changed. Now we have Charter of Human Rights, etc. But at the beginning it was a peace project, but an economic unity.
Should we collect questions, do you think? I think what we might do is collect some questions. We have one here, Daniel. No, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and I'm a political geographer and professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam, although I'm here at the IVM as a guest now for a couple of months, and also of partially Italian, partially Galician background, so I can kind of cover all realms here. My question regards, I think, a point that many of you kind of touched upon, which is this question of emotional attachments, which also goes to the opening presentations and the failure of the European project to somehow stimulate that sort of emotional attachment. And what worries me is that there seems to be still this presumption, this goes back to your talk, Stephen, which I really appreciated, this assumption of a somehow necessary congruence between attachment and territory. And one of, so I want to kind of go back to your both and logic, because what happens, as you very nicely described in 1918, is precisely the breakdown of that order, right? And kind of the initiation of a new order that we still carry today, which presumes such a congruence of peoples, nations, and territory, whether having to do with the politics of memory. You can't hear me. I mean, okay. Thank you. It translates both into the politics of memory. So I think I'll pick on you, Catherine, for that, but also politics of representation, right? So if I can ask a kind of direct question to you, you were talking about the fact that Ukraine's problem is a territorial problem, which to me is worrisome because that presumes in kind of one people, one memory, one territory, which is very problematic. But then also ask the question about European representation. So as most of you will know, there was the suggestion of creating transnational constituencies for the European Parliament to make good use of the seats vacated by the British, but that was very much kind of sidelined. We're still not able to think in those terms. So the both and logic still seems impossible. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let's see if there's one more on this side, and then we will... There's one back there, Salome. And then we will go into the answer round.
Thank you. My name is Øyvind Seim. I'm working on the breakup of Yugoslavia. So we're talking about ghosts, Habsburg Empire, or bigger empires, multicultural one, EU. I think we should also mention the word Yugoslavia, which was not mentioned initially. Because we're talking about dates, the 1st of December is also an important date, the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs and Croats and Slovenes. And I would dispute Stephen Beller's description about all countries being created after the breakup of Habsburg Empire as nation states or attempted ones, since Yugoslavia was not attempting something like that. It's more or less a multicultural one. So talk about the lessons of a breakup we should also talk about the lessons of breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s and the dysfunctionality that was created in that area. And therefore, I would just like to quote about don't break up complex entities just because of some flaws here and there. That was from Stephen Beller. And we could also discuss how that breakup, but of course together with the general reopening of Eastern Europe through the end of the Cold War, also recreated the Habsburg Empire to a certain degree, at least strengthened Austria. Vienna is reaching towards 2 million people again. You have reintegrated the markets and generally a strengthening of Austria to some degree on expense of at least the southeastern Europe. But we can discuss the interpretation, what was in Yugoslavia and who were responsible for that breakup in 1991, but I'll leave that. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we have a first round of answers or responses to these questions?
Should I?
You want to go first? You were just...
Okay, right, yes. In order, you're quite right about the working class. But of course, that was a problem in most of Europe around 1900. But Vienna was not atypical in that sense. And it was probably better than Russia. Again, it was probably better than Russia or places to the southeast and south. But what's interesting, of course, is that the Social Democrats themselves had plans for the monarchy as a direct cultural autonomy and a multinational polity. So it's the idea of not so much the social level, but on the kind of the cultural or ethnic level, national level. The Social Democrats also had a very similar idea about how to organize these things. The economic nature of the European Union, and it's interesting that is now emphasized, that the Habsburg monarchy was a positive unit because it was a single market, and I think that's true, that the monarchy did benefit people but by being this economic free trade area. But there's an irony here talking about Schumann and Monet. At least Schumann, right, was from Lorraine, was he? Yes. Habsburg Lothringen.
From Luxembourg originally.
Right, but it doesn't matter because the whole thing was at one point part of the Habsburg domains in one form or another. And of course Alsace, but the Alsace-Lorraine was exactly one of these borderlands, which had been Habsburg, was part of France, then became part of France, became part of Germany, became part of, and talk about Ukraine. Well, Ukraine means, does it not, kind of borderland, and we're talking about Bosnia, Krajina, right? So I suppose one way of symbolically emphasizing how important Europe, as the Habsburg monarchy once was, how important Europe is today, would be to point out, and Northern Ireland being the most relevant example at the moment, is how important Europe, the concept of the superstructure of Europe, as it were, is to resolving and making possible interaction between groups that otherwise would not be able to cooperate with each other because there is nothing to mediate. or framework, or frame these problems and conflicts. And that's a very important thing, which I think people do not realize, still do not realize. And so someone should write a book about it, or write a film about, or make a film about it, because I think one of the things is that, in fact, we can talk as much as we like here about getting a European identity or whatever, but someone has to show what's important about Europe. That's much more effective than actually just talking about it.
I mean, I could very well be wrong about this because I don't know if there's any studies of it, but what I've experienced in talking to people is that there is a sea change almost in the mindset of the people who are controlling discourse in Brussels today. I mean, the founders, the people who negotiated the entrance of Austria into the European Union, these are the old-time diplomats. And I was talking to Mrs. Briggs last night about Bernhard Stillfried, God love him, a man who incorporated everything that I know of that's positive in a person in public life. His idea of a good day was to work 25 hours for somebody else. To get to help them to get their job done well, and that is, I mean, it's no secret, not something we talk very loudly about. Something we should probably talk a little bit more about the great dedication of Austrian diplomats after World War II. The good pleasure, good fortune to have known several. People with inexhaustible energy. This sort of person is disappearing. I mean, the younger generation, not simply here but everywhere, have a much more suppressed existence. They have many more things to do. I mean, we're surrounded, as we all know, by an information explosion all the time. We have to do, our little brains have to do much more work than they once did, because there's just so much that one has to synthesize. I mean, this is just there, and it's not easy to be the universal person. It's not easy to have a Bildung as one once had it, as one once got it, because you have to have so much information just to get around the world. But nevertheless, without Bildung, Ausbildung won't take you very far in the end, collectively.
Okay, I think Kate and then Stephen, and then you want to make it, we need to be fast because we want to have another round of questions.
Okay, I will be as fast as I can, but just to say I'm delighted that Borderlands have entered into this discussion, because I think that is supremely important for what we're talking about here. And actually that then gets me, I mean, in a way that relates exactly to what Louisa was saying. And I think that I apologize, I think I made my point came across exactly the opposite of what I wanted to say, which is that Ukraine's 20th century experience of not having an integral territory that was not contested has actually made it a much more sort of multi-ethnic, open country as it exists today. The narrative of it as being split into halves between Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, this is complete nonsense. It is a multilingual country in which people are happy operating across those boundaries. And I think it's precisely because there wasn't the co-terminality of territory and people that's possible. So thank you for allowing me to step in and clarify that. But with regards to Borderlands, just very quickly, the sort of Galician Russian imperial borderland is actually what I mainly focus on in my own research. And that, I think, highlights so clearly the importance of having multinational structures. So the one incident that I find absolutely fascinating is in 1882, there was a village 20 kilometers from the border with the Russian Empire in Habsburg, Galicia. In it, about 100 villagers decided that they were going to convert from Greek Catholicism to Orthodoxy. as the result of this, 12 peasants, more or less, were tried for high treason with the possibility of a capital charge for a small village deciding for entirely religious reasons to convert to Orthodoxy. It was simply because they were so close to the Russian border that Vienna looked at it and said, this is a huge threat. So when you have these hard external borders, they become these foreign policy flashpoints in a way that sort of internal borders within a system of pooled sovereignty does not have them. So.
Yes, well, I realize I did not answer a couple of the points that were raised in the first round. So the Yugoslavia, if you talk to, who's the gentleman talk about Yugoslavia? Hi, yes. So, yes, that is a good example. And in fact, there are many American, you go to Washington to this day, and there are many American diplomats and people associated with the region who will say that was a mistake, breaking up Yugoslavia. Whether or not Yugoslavia was a multinational, multicultural state, at least in the idea of 1918, is an interesting one. But because the point was that they all thought of themselves, at least the politicians involved, all thought of themselves as Yugoslavians. So they may have been different, but they were they thought of themselves as a unit, as associated, and that was a more natural unit than they had been in the Habsburg monarchy. So there is a kind of nationalist, I should say, a nationalist reason why Yugoslavia was formed. But you're right. It actually was a multicultural, multinational state, and as I said, from an American perspective, at least, it was a mistake to break up Yugoslavia. Going back to Italians and you said Polish and Italian, is that right? There's this this is an illustration of kind of the multinational nature of the Habsburg monarchy. I remember a lecture by a historian of Yiddish literature who talked about this group of Yiddish poets who would meet in a Viennese coffee house in Lemberg, in Lviv. It was called Café Abbazia. Because, of course, right, Abbazia, because and they were both parts of the Habsburg monarchy. In fact, I think they were both parts of the Austrian part of the monarchy. One end here and the other end there. So these Yiddish poets sat amongst all these beautiful illustrations of the Mediterranean. So this is this is kind of the plurality of the Habsburg monarchy. So that's. And in that sense, right, when I don't understand why when English tourists go down to Torremolinos or as in the Monty Python song or whatever, they don't understand that this is Europe. This is right, and why if they're living in southwest France, they can come up with the idea that, well, Brexit's okay. How can they do this? Because they are living the both-and existence. But it's very difficult to translate that into the politics of national interest, and I think that's one of the dilemmas we have in Europe today. Okay, that's enough.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one quick round of questions. Daniel, there are actually two questions here in the third row, and then Salome, do you have any on your side? Yeah, so we'll take these three.
I'm Paul Louis, lectured at Vienna University and a specialist for the European Union. I'm coming, actually, I was born in Burgenland, which is some kind of border region, used to be part of Austria only since 1921, so 1918 is not so important for me, because at that time we were not part of Austria. But I want to go back to 1918, 1919, to the peace treaties. And at that time, the Western powers, in particular France, created these nation states in Central Europe. And my experience with Brussels, or when I was there quite often, the Western Europeans do not understand these Central Europeans. There is a very big distance between the thinking of history and the thinking of thinking of nationalism, etc., between Western and Central Europe. And this, I mean, if you listen about what the French or politicians talk about the Hungarians, and I have relatives in Hungary, so I'm quite sensitive for that, about the Hungarians or the Poles or the Austrians sometimes shocks me. And I think this is one big problem for the European Union, historically seen that the understanding between Western Europe, because of its history, and Central Europe, because of its history, is decreasing, and these older politicians in France, etc., which still had this background of Habsburg or whatever, don't exist anymore. And therefore, I'm very afraid that this split between Central and Western Europe will increase in the future.
Hi, my name is Salwa Youssef. I'm a writer and editor. I came here because I was very interested in the title, Why History Matters, because ever since I studied history at school, the older I've gotten, the more I've been reaching the conclusion that history does not matter. So I was coming here hoping that all of you would convince me that I was wrong, but in fact, I know it's early, but in fact, so far, you've strengthened my belief that history really does not matter, and I will tell you why. I talk a lot to young people, and their concerns are very different. They don't read the books you're recommending. They don't read the studies that you're talking about. There's a huge schism between old and new, and I think, I mean this in the most respectful way, you're all holed up in your academic worlds. The Europe that I see now, the New World Order has already come. We're already living it. Because European borders have ceased to exist, we can travel throughout Europe easily. With the Erasmus programs, a lot of students are moving to other countries to study. They're meeting partners, they're getting married. There's a lot of marriages where children have a father from one nationality, mother from another nationality, and they're growing up in a third nationality. This is becoming more and more and more and more a reality. I would say it is already a reality, especially here in Vienna. I'm amazed to see how much intermarriage there are. So I think the young people of the 20s and 30s have pretty much lost the identity with their home country as much as people in their 40s, 50s, and older have. And they know their children will also not have this identity anymore. So you, Rinna, asked this question about the European identity, and I think I would prefer to look forward rather than to look ahead. Where are we today? Today we already are in a very mixed Europe. And so my question to you, and I would really like to hear from you, Rinna, is how soon do you think it will be, because I really believe that's a reality that's going to happen, how soon do you think it will be that we will ditch our European national passports and have European passports? So we're no more Austrian or Dutch or German or Belgian, but Europeans. Yeah, because I think this is the new identity, and I also think the younger people in their 20s and 30s are moving away from all the old institutions, not just the EU, but also the United Nations and NATO and all these old institutions. They're all crumbling.
Okay, we have a final question back there.
Yes, all right, thank you. My name is Maximilian Gruber, and I'm a first-year MICE student at this institution, and I'm here because I studied history before, so obviously I'm interested. My question goes back to what Katherine Younger actually said about identity and about the Franz Josef pictures that you can find nowadays in Ukraine. Now, my question is, how long has it been like this? Because what I was thinking is this only a development of the last decades maybe, or is it something that was even there maybe in the times of communism? Or more generally speaking, is the Habsburg identity something that is maybe used in certain national states nowadays in order to overcome certain parts of history that might be quite uncomfortable to the people, as it is the case in Austria, in my opinion? And secondly, and this goes to what Mr. Beller said, You mentioned Yiddish authors and identification, what identification with the Habsburg state meant for them. So my question is, would you argue that for Jewish or Yiddish-speaking authors in the monarchy was even maybe a higher factor of identification because their community had been discriminated against for a long time, and also they were a very heterogeneous group within the empire? So these are my questions to you.
Okay, thanks. We have a final round. You want to start first?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I have two answers. For the year, I don't know. But yes, so I'm also concerned with all the points that you brought up, and I have two ways that I've been dealing with it. In my classroom, I teach global history, and I try to bring as diverse subject matter to the class as possible. Why? Because unlike when I was very young, Finland had mostly only Finnish and Swedish and some Russian-speaking people there. Now Finnish society is very diverse. And I'm worried about that if we only teach Finnish history or Western European history, all the people who live in the country and our citizens will not be interested in those classes that we're teaching because it doesn't reflect the world upon them. In my global history classes, I have many topics from all over the world, but also those that are particularly pertaining to Finland, such as the Sami people's history in the north and many diverse subjects. In addition to the classroom curriculum, that I have thought about this, that we actually have very many intermarriages in my country. The problem though is that Finnish language is very particular and difficult to learn. So, you know, this creates a border, yeah. In addition to that, I work with a civic organization that I help to fund called Historians Without Borders. And sometimes civic organizations are very good at also discussing these types of questions. What we did a report this year about how colonial and post-colonial history is taught in every level of the school in Finland. And we asked for feedback also from minority groups, everyone that we could find and be significant of, and we've been having a dialogue about it. Why? Because the question is not only that history teaching is important and colonial and post-colonial histories matter, but also because if we only teach Finnish or Western European history, the people living in Finland will not be interested in history, and I would like to see every kind of person in my classroom being interested in history.
Stephen?
There are many questions, and I have more answers than questions. This will reverse. So let me start with the Jewish question that was asked. Yes, I think Jews in the Habsburg monarchy realized that their status had greatly improved because of the constitutional guarantees of equality of religion and so on. On the ground, the politics especially the nationalist politics of the Habsburg monarchy was not good for Jews, right? Usually, there were pogroms in Galicia, and there was the Christian socials in Vienna, but the state and the constitutional guarantees, that was something that Jews appreciated. And again, in day-to-day life, that they had more possibilities, ironically, in the Habsburg monarchy than other states, other national states. There is, of course, a parallel with Europe, the European Union today, which is that in theory, and this is a theory that I think probably Ruth Vodak would agree with, that one of the advantages for the European Union for Jews is that Jews can be Europeans, right? And as it were, have not be totally dependent on the national identity that they, in the way that they once used to have to. The irony is, of course, that I was at a conference and someone actually pointed out, well, that's not really what European Jews think. the actual European Jewish leadership groups and so on, because they see themselves as basically associated with Israel now. So the European identity of Jews is actually kind of somewhat mitigated by the Israeli identity of Jews these days in Europe. That being said, Western Europe and Central Europe, and it's associated, I think there is a especially strong French national identity, which is basically a Westphalian one, where there is only French still. And within that, you can be of a religious group, but the idea of having a cultural or racial or ethnic difference from being French is still a problem. So in that sense, it's not this kind of Central European experience, at least the Habsburg memory thereof. And that, I think, is a problem and explains some of the problems with the European discussion in Brussels today. And then finally, on there are other questions, but finally, on the question of young people and whether history matters, I think it does matter. Because, of course, the irony is that the young people, although Allan, I think, I would not totally agree with Allan, because I think that actually young people are incredibly adept. There's more cultural dexterity, as it were, amongst the young today, with their little machines and so on and so forth, and being so connected to the World Wide Web, etc. There's much more cultural dexterity and much more diversity in their views on what music they listen to, what art, what everything, than there was in the previous generation. Because to that extent, building is rather restrictive compared to what's available to today's young people. And of course, it's true that also true in terms of Brexit, for instance. If the people who actually are going to be living 50 years from now had been asked whether they wanted to be members of the European Union, they would be resoundingly yes. It was the older generation who were living in some imperial mythology who said no. They wanted to go back to baked beans on toast or something. So right. Which is their historical memory. Now, maybe the lesson, therefore, is that maybe the older generation needs to realise that history matters, and that history is part of continuity into the future. Because there's so many of the nationalists in Europe at the moment are looking backwards and manipulating history in such a way that they're making the future impossible for the young people who actually want to be a part of a larger, more open world. The one where I would disagree with you is that means you have to pay more attention to the European Union, more attention to the United Nations if you're a young person, because you cannot have an international community, an international global community, without political structures. And at that point, whether it's politics or history, that is something that really does matter. Because otherwise, the idea of having an anarchic international community, for instance, is a terrible thing.
Okay. All right, Katherine, we have to speed up because our beans on toast is waiting for us.
I want to make. I don't necessarily disagree with you, Stephen, but what disturbs me is the fact that this wide interest among young people does not come into politics, because politics is very dull in comparison to what you're describing, all these technological dazzling developments. I mean, it's hard work, seems to go no place. Now, what the gentleman just said reminded me of something very important. I mean, I came to Europe to live in the early 80s, and was often in Paris in those days. And Paris was full of Central Europeans, and Central European Jews mostly. But I mean, they were Frenchmen. They all spoke perfect French. I mean, they were integrated in ways that people aren't now. I mean, it's precisely that which has gotten lost. This universal culture. I have a quote which is unfortunately too long to cite here, from the beginning of John Keegan's book on World War I. And what the point of this quote is, he said, the people that went to war, and he's speaking about the officer class in 1914, understood each other perfectly. They not only understood each other, they could feel with one another because they had the same kind of Bildung, and he gives a long description of it. You get the short version of it and the most wonderful version of it, of what I'm describing and what Keegan's describing in La Grande Illusion of Jean Renoir, Rauffenstein and Boileau, who, despite everything else, understand each other perfectly.
Okay, Kate, would you like to have the last word?
Oh dear. I very quickly to all three, thank you so much. That's a great question, and we can. I would love to talk about it more. But yes, it has been going on for a long time. There's a fabulous book called The Idea of Galicia by Larry Wolff that talks extensively about this. I would direct you there. With regards to the point about Western versus Eastern, one other distinction. Sorry, Central. Apologies. One distinction that I would make there that to me sort of helps explain it is that the Central European experience in the 20th century is defined by the collapse of the land empires after World War I, whereas the West is defined much more by the collapse of the overseas empires after World War II. And so I think that that distinction right there can perhaps help to explain some of that difference in mentality. And then finally, with regards to whether or not history matters, I think history will matter far more if we can create a much more innovative transnational narrative of it that better reflects the lives that these people, that younger people today are living. And that is a big task ahead of us, but events like this today are a step towards that, so thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks to all of the participants on the panel here.